Dankeschön. It's 1600 local time in Vienna, so late afternoon. All my buddies and comrades are leaving the building, so I'm left alone here and will be quiet enough to listen to you. And all my attention comes to your speeches now. Me personally, I'm Dirk Heinzmann. I'm a German Air Force professional officer. I was starting in the 80s, so last century, last millennium, flying Tornado aircraft. So I'm a professional pilot, nuclear weapons and every kind of activity. And I was switched over to the lecturing and researching aspects, where I started in Hamburg. Hamburg, as you see the flag, the right flag up there, the red one, was lecturing on air power and space power, and as well as operational art. And linked to that is, of course, upwards the strategic part, military strategic part, a little bit of the grand strategy, and downwards a little bit to the tactical issues. And to the side, of course, all aspects of whole of government approach. Here in Austria, I'm an exchange officer, senior lecturer, as they call it here, and researcher for the same topics. And the main emphasis goes to the General Staff Officer course from Austria and back home in Germany as well. So that's my person, my background. And I'm proud to be your host for, well, at least your chair for this afternoon. And I've read your abstracts, and I'm really interested to listen to you now and follow the questions which might come up as well. Please be aware we have 90 minutes only. That means if we have 4 people to speak only, we can extend it a little bit. But I ask you to keep it between 15, maximum 20 minutes. That opens the door and gives the platform for asking questions, for reiterating some aspects if they are not clear enough. When Peter shows up, or even Arnold shows up, we might cut down your speaking time to 12 minutes. Please understand that. So to give them the platform, the ability to speak as well here in that session, otherwise 15 to 20 minutes. And you will see who's attending and listening. So then we act accordingly, please. Recording was done, welcome was done. Do you have any questions for me right now for this session? Should be fairly easy. Welcome again. The speaking order, I do not know which order we want to go. Maybe Lucas, because you're on my full screen now, you start out first. And then next Gintautas, please, and Cagdas, right? Cagdas.
With ch.
Cagdas. Sorry, I have to ask.
It's perfect.
Thank you. So, are you ready to move, Lucas? Please. So, let me scroll back. We do see your slide, and I go on mute.
Great. Okay, so I won't introduce myself, it's fine. So my topic today is conceptual resilience versus social utility in strategic thinking. And basically what I try to do here is follow the conference theme on resilience and to take a novel approach to both strategic theory and strategic thinking and the concept of resilience by combining the two. So essentially, the structure of my talk is very simple. First, I'll talk about resilience for 4 slides. Then I'll talk about social utility for 4 slides. And then I'll talk about how to instill resilience in our strategic thinking for 4 slides. So to get started, resilience has become a pretty fashionable concept in IR more broadly, in security, in defense. You know, the theme of this conference is a good example of that, of its popularity. And although its sort of popularity has been growing over the past 2 decades, it's really, I think, sort of skyrocketed, especially in the security and defense sphere, with Crimea 2014 and Russia's actions thereafter in terms of disinformation and corruption, money laundering, and all these sorts of things, because our first sort of response is to simply try to make our society, our population, et cetera, more resilient. But the thing is that resilience is not a concept which is native to strategy or defense or security or even international relations in general. So we need to really talk about resilience first before we get into resilience of strategic thinking. So resilience as a concept is one which has been imported into IR and related fields, basically from engineering, from psychology, from ecology. These are sort of the three main fields which developed thinking on resilience. Probably excepting engineering, in psychology and in ecology, it's a fairly contested concept. So we'll talk about that first. And there's three main issues to discuss in terms of how resilience is conceptualized in psychology and in ecology. So first, there's sort of the debate, is resilience an outcome? Is it something you can just achieve for the system of whatever you're talking about and leave it at that? Is it, say, a personal or a collective trait or characteristic? Is this just something which some people, some systems have and others don't? Or is it a process? So that's important. Second, what constitutes resilience? Is resilience really just about coping with the stressful, the adverse influence and then bouncing back, basically to a more or less prior state? Or is there a degree of subsequent transformation and learning from the experience? This is something you see more, I think, in the psychology literature, where a number of experts have suggested that, well, yes, even when someone has experienced trauma, for instance, as they sort of overcome that trauma, they grow as a person. So there's this transformative element. But it does introduce sort of a strange contradiction in the very concept of resilience, because it's resistant to change, but then the result is a different change. So it's somewhat bizarre. Third, is resilience value neutral, or is it inherently good? So essentially, the issue here is it inherently good for things to be resilient? In terms of ecology and in terms of psychology, we think, inherently, yes, right? It's good that environments are resilient. It's good that people are resilient. It's certainly good in engineering where construction projects or vehicles or whatever are physically resilient as well. But resilience can also be an attribute of, say, malign actors, in which case it's not quite so good. So these are sort of the three main axes of discussion when it comes to resilience in these fields, particularly psychology and ecology. But then moving on from there to conceptual resilience, because we have to adapt these things to the notion of conceptual resilience. The first question is really, is conceptual resilience a natural idea? And the answer in many ways is no, not necessarily. It's actually kind of a strange idea, and would be considered quite strange in a number of fields which are not strategic studies. The main reason for this is that strategic theory, in terms of the way it's structured, in terms of the way it simply is substantially different from theory in other fields, notably international relations and various other subfields of international relations, where a theory is generally taken to be a more sort of formal causal relationship between A and B. So you can have any number of theories in the field, whereas in strategic studies, theory is sort of the whole body of knowledge on war and strategy. And you're meant to use that body of knowledge to make your own judgments about whatever strategic situation we're facing. So strategic theory is its own system in a way which IR theory as a body of theory isn't necessarily, because it's all about the individual theories in IR. So it's not a natural idea. So is conceptual resilience inherently good? Now, in many respects, the answer to this question is beyond the scope of this paper, so I'm not really going to talk about it. If you want, we can talk about it a bit in discussion. But my assumption here is yes, that it is inherently good, because it's my opinion that Clausewitzian-inspired strategic theory is, at the moment at least, still the best form of theory we have when it comes to war and strategy. However, saying that, I do recognize that it's not inherently self-evident that it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't have concepts like hybrid warfare and gray zone warfare and these sorts of things. So there is a discussion to be had here. I'm just not doing it right now. Another somewhat strange aspect of conceptual resilience is conceptual resilience in the face of what adverse influence. Whereas when it comes to, say, ecology, psychology, engineering, whatever, we tend to think in terms of resilience against external factors, external threats, external influences. But with conceptual resilience, yes, there is an external dimension, because much of the thinking which challenges existing strategic theory is inspired by events such as what Russia did in Crimea in 2014. But the actual threats themselves, such as hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, are concepts which we develop ourselves. So it's sort of an internal threat, which leads to a kind of weird dynamic where we sort of have to protect our thinking against our own thinking. Having said that, also it's worth mentioning what conceptual resilience is not, and it's not conceptual stasis. I'm not saying, Clausewitzian theory is the best ever, and there's no way it can be improved. Read Clausewitz and no one else. I'd be out of a job then, because I write things as well. It's not that. Rather, it's that in changing our thinking and the concepts we use, the relationships among concepts which we identify, change should be done responsibly with an eye to sort of the systemic effects of our changes. And this is relatively rarely done. That's the problem. Moving from conceptual resilience to social utility, which I'm introducing as the opposite of conceptual resilience. This, again, is perhaps a rather strange thing to suggest, that social utility is a flaw in strategic thinking, because virtually every strategic thinker, going back to Sun Tzu, has emphasized that strategic thinking should be relevant to practice, right? And the quote here is from Bernard Brodie: "Above all, strategic theory is a theory for action." So in this context, how can social utility be a flaw when it comes to sort of strategic thinking? Well, first of all, it's worth remembering that these sorts of statements, such as Brodie's on the relevance of theory to practice, tend to implicitly focus on certain things. We're talking about the practice of strategy, the conduct of campaigns. And if you go back to, say, Sun Tzu or any of the ancient or early modern theorists, battlefield tactics and formations, force structure and design, these sorts of things. So things which are inherently oriented toward the battlefield, ultimately, in some way or another, in greater or lesser context. But social utility here is understood as something somewhat different from that. Essentially, social utility here is understood as being the ability to command political attention or bureaucratic attention, to be able to spur, to enable political consensus or bureaucratic effort, these sorts of things. And I'm not saying that these are not important things, because they clearly are. Armies ultimately are organizations. They do serve politicians, and so getting political attention can be quite crucial for defense policy, defense planning, and ultimately for strategy. But the point is, focusing on these can, not always, but they can run counter to good strategic thinking. And this is particularly the case when the social utility we're sort of grabbing at is being achieved by ad hoc revisions to strategic thinking, to new concepts which sort of just emerge on the scene as a result of a single thing which happened in Crimea or something like that. rather than the sorts of responsible changes which I sort of discussed earlier, with an eye to the systemic implications of conceptual change and that sort of thing. So to give hybrid warfare as a very brief example of this, I'm sure, as we all know, it's been roundly criticized academically. It's not new, it's too vague, it has little operational value, little strategic value, and it confuses existing concepts unnecessarily. There's no need to confuse the distinction between war and peace, but hybrid warfare does so. Nonetheless, it remains highly popular, specifically because it has social utility. Interestingly, I learned just last week that it seems like hybrid warfare is very much a European thing. Apparently, in the US Department of Defense, they don't talk about hybrid warfare. They're sort of over that. So it's become sort of a European holdout in terms of strategic thinking, which is something I was not aware of before, but it's interesting. It's a sort of European and a NATO alliance thing, but not an American thing. So if you look at hybrid warfare, it's highly popular because it's used primarily for communication. Sorry, I had class this morning, so my throat's going a bit. I also had class last night. It's used primarily for communication. And this communication is used to lead to political consensus building. If hybrid warfare can mean like anything to everyone who uses it, then it's very easy to get consensus on hybrid warfare because no one's actually clarifying what they mean. They just all agree that it's bad and something should be done about it. It's also then used to mobilize the military bureaucracies, especially, say, the NATO alliance bureaucracy, and to spur them into action, spur them into undergoing certain revisions or certain actions which they previously had not done because they're perhaps a bit on autopilot. So there's that sort of social dimension as well. And as I mentioned, this is particularly notable in NATO as a military alliance. Earlier this year, a PhD was finished at the University of Louvain, particularly on hybrid warfare and sort of the role it played in NATO, which ultimately emphasized these sorts of dimensions. Also a few others, such as giving signals to Russia, but the political consensus building aspect, the mobilizing military bureaucracy aspect, and that sort of thing. But in general, it's worth noting that concepts whose main virtue is social utility tend to be presentist, such as hybrid warfare. This is a problem which we need to solve right now, or in gray zone warfare and so forth. They tend to, not always, but often they tend to emerge from professional militaries. In part because militaries are not trained to think deeply for the most part. That's not what militaries are there for. That's what academics are for. Militaries are there ultimately to be the sharp end of the spear. But nonetheless, a lot of this sort of thinking does tend to emerge, or at least be popularized by professional militaries. And moreover, these concepts do tend to have professional militaries, but then also civilian policymakers as their primary audiences. Academics are not a primary audience of these concepts because they are meant to have this sort of social utility. And finally, they are disproportionately popular compared to their usefulness as strategic theory. Of course, we can have a discussion about this as well if you disagree on the value of hybrid warfare, but from my perspective, that's the case. But what I would want to sort of conclude when it comes to social utility is that militaries are sort of caught between two stools, and they can't really sit on both at once, because militaries do have to sort of operate in the realm of defense, in the realm of defense policy, in defense planning. Things like political attention, bureaucratic momentum, and these sorts of things are crucial to how militaries actually do things, especially in peacetime. So they have to be aware of these, they have to be able to master these processes. At the same time, militaries are there ultimately to fight if necessary, which requires engaging with strategy. So militaries always tend to keep an eye out on strategy and strategic studies as well. But as I said, there's this usual, if not always, the case that there's contradiction between these two things. So what can you do? So when it comes to instilling conceptual resilience, because as I mentioned, I think conceptual resilience is an inherent good. it's worth noting that doing so, instilling conceptual resilience, is hard for a number of reasons. First, and this is invoking the famous quote from British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan when he said, when he was asked, what were the main challenges to your prime ministership? Events, dear boy, events. Stuff happens, and often it seems like we need new concepts to understand them and to deal with them. You know, hybrid warfare being a good example of that. So there's this inherent process of adapting to events makes creating conceptual resilience difficult. Moreover, and I alluded to this before, the sort of ad hoc thinkers who develop concepts such as hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, and so forth, basically by definition, do not recognize the authority of existing strategic theory to begin with. Because if they did, they wouldn't need these other concepts. They just look in the strategic canon and understand things that way. Moreover, not everyone is prepared to think systemically. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. It requires a very holistic appreciation of what is ultimately an abstract body of knowledge. So the result is that even the defenders of classical strategic theory often assume the authority of that theory in arguing for that theory's continued authority, which misses the point, and it inherently will fail to convince the ad hoc thinkers. So, but it's sort of clear to me that given the role the military plays in generating and popularizing these concepts, education is crucial, or education, inappropriate education is the root of a lot of bad strategic thinking. So education is crucial when it comes to trying to instill conceptual resilience. And you can think of, you know, still in many military faculties, in PME institutions, yes, Clausewitz is taught, but often the Clausewitz which is taught is the Clausewitz which is fashionable in the military, rather than necessarily the most accurate interpretation of Clausewitz. So it's not just what you teach, it's how you teach it. So, for the purposes here, I'm going to focus on PME, but it's just as relevant and useful for civilian institutions as well, or any of those which teach strategy. So and it revolves around how to teach theory ultimately, because the point is, we don't think that there's use in the existing theory. That's why we need new thinking. So how do you teach good theory, or how do you teach theory well? What does this involve? Well, one, you have to teach the concepts themselves. Not just that Clausewitz said that the definition of war is this, but what is the definition of war? That's step one. Step two is teaching the interrelationships among the concepts. And what is the relationship between war and politics, or war and peace, or for that matter, between peace and politics? But these two alone are insufficient, because you can learn what Clausewitz said about these things, about how to define war, about the relationship between war and politics. But that doesn't necessarily mean you understand, let alone agree with. And you're not meant to agree, but you should at least understand. So the good theoretical teaching requires, I think, a third feature, and that's teaching the logic which underpins and shapes the concepts. So, for example, if we know that Clausewitz defined war as an act of violence to impose a will upon the enemy, what are the conceptual elements of that definition? Why those? What do they mean? Individually and in aggregate as part of a single definition. And what is the logic of the concept as they work together? And then how does that allow you to use the concept? And sort of teaching theory at this level is what tends to be missing quite a bit, I think. And in teaching the logic of theory, the ambition is not to turn the professional military into theorists. Again, that's not what it's there for. But rather, it's to try to allow military officers or anyone who uses strategic theory the responsible use of these concepts in analysis and practical application, as the case may be. This in turn would then enable the differentiation of, say, systemic or system compatible concepts such as clause switching thinking and stuff which fits in with that, versus the ad hoc concepts such as hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, and that sort of thing. And then it'll allow us then to teach the ad hoc concepts as what they really are, which is not necessarily analytical concepts, but really following, like really reinforcing the dimension of social utility, that they're marketing concepts, they're marketing tools. So teach them as such. Teach them that you use them to get attention, you use them to get the money, the budget, and then you do strategy. So to wrap up, this is my last slide. Not all concepts are equal. Some fit into systemic strategic theory, others don't. So they're useful in different contexts and in different ways in different contexts, being the sort of analytical marketing distinction. So we need to be able to differentiate among concepts and the way in which we use them so that we can use each of them responsibly, so that we don't confuse ourselves in the process. And therefore, going back to what I was saying about resilience at the very beginning in terms of, is it an output, an outcome? Is it a characteristic? Is it a process? In my approach here, essentially resilience comes down to a way of thinking and a way of engaging with our thinking, which then underpins the process of doing so, and therefore allows our strategic thinking to be resilient, even in the face of challenges, while still at the same time allowing us to derive the benefit of the more sort of socially useful marketing type concepts. So I have no idea how long that took me. I imagine probably around 15 minutes or so, and I'll end with that.
Thank you, Lucas. I'm back on audio. It was 23 minutes. You're losing the time, but you know too much. Maybe that's the reason. Yeah, don't worry. We do have the time. We are only 3 speakers here right now. Thank you for the presentation. I took a lot from your abstract, even more from your presentation and the slides you gave us. But first, I would like to open the floor to possible questions from the other 2 listeners or to other guests which are in this sessions as well. Are there any questions right now or notations?
Sorry, I do have a question.
Vicky, yes.
Really enjoyed your presentation. And yesterday, actually, I was given a presentation myself and talking about basically PME and cultural change and some of the things that we sort of need to have in the classroom, I guess to say, to open up that dialogue and do with that, where I'm not asking our military students to become theorists, but I do definitely need to have them participate in theory and use that to inform their actions going forward. Anyway, one of the thoughts that I have been having about this and how professors can have that conversation is about almost going through a conceptual framework process with the students so that they understand. And it's interesting how I think that parallels a large extent of what you're talking about. I guess to say, with the suggestions that you have proposed, have you been using them yourself in the classroom, and are you finding it effective? And what sort of resistance do you have with the students to try to get them into that theoretical space, but yet stay within their own sort of strategic mind?
That's an interesting question. Thanks, Vicky. So far, well, the thing is, for one, I'm not involved really in PME.
Okay.
I teach at a civilian university, and my students are all younger than me, rather than older and more distinguished, and perhaps with actual combat experience. So I don't have those sorts of, in my own classrooms, I don't have those sorts of impediments to my teaching, which can be meaningful. Otherwise, in terms of actually teaching the logic, so far it's gone reasonably. The thing is, and I'm sure that this is also true, would be true in PME, you have to cover so much that it becomes hard to engage properly with theory. In part because I imagine I'm the only one offering a strategic studies elective in my program. So I basically have to cram all of strategy into 13 weeks.
Okay.
Whereas which is will inherently make it a bit superficial. I try to drive in on the key issues such as defining war, defining strategy, breaking that stuff down and whatnot. But having a full program to do that would make it a bit easier to be able to dedicate the time and the effort to do so. But there are also, I think, potentially interesting ways of emphasizing certain elements of these concepts. So, for example, one of the key things I keep reiterating to my students is that strategy is adversarial. It's one thing to sort of learn that in the classroom, okay, there's an enemy involved. But then at the end of the semester, my students play a war game against each other. They're split into teams, and then they basically have to beat the other side. And that sort of really brings home in a more visceral way that actually what having an enemy actually means. Mm-hmm. So trying to bring that sort of more experiential angle into the teaching of concepts, I think has a lot of promise. And it's something you can do short of war games as well. So if we talk about the Clausewitzian definition of war, just sort of ask your students to put themselves in the position of policymakers, and then sort of break down Clausewitz's definition of war element by element. Act of violence. Okay, if you just talk about that, slap someone across the face, that's an act of violence, that'll be war. Obviously, that's not war. So then you add in the next conceptual element, which is an enemy, which means me slapping someone isn't enough. They at least have to slap me back. But if you think in common sense, that's still not war. So you add the elements and you sort of explore what they mean and sort of narrow it down like that. And I think that sort of approach, that's really what it means to sort of dig into the conceptual logic of these things.
Lucas, thank you. We have to cut it a little short because we're coming close to half an hour.
Sure.
Vicky, thanks for your question and the polite answer. Any other points?
Cagdas had raised his hand, but he may have
raised, but yeah, we are running out of time. Maybe I can ask my question later if we have additional time.
That's fine.
Depends. Yeah. Your question is fine. The speaker is taking too long, so when he is more concise on answering.
Okay, let me mention my question, then we will decide. Lucas, it was a great presentation. I really find it informative for my own research as well. You mentioned the value of resilience as a concept, and I mean the question of whether or not it is value natural, if it is naturally good. These are very interesting questions I am also asking myself, and it reminded me of Jeremy Walker's critique, and it turns out to be, I mean, for their perspective, it turns out to be from a critical concept to the concept of power methodology. So do you agree with this criticism, or how it might help us to rethink conceptual resilience in our strategic decision-making process? Of course, it is, you mentioned it is not naturally good or bad, but from the Cold War era to a post-Cold War era, how the things change in terms of applying resilience as a concept?
Well, I'll give a short answer now, and then if we have time at the end, then I can fill it out. One thing which is worth noting is that in importing resilience from other fields, sort of IR and subfields, have ultimately taken resilience to be an unalloyed good. In large degree, because, well, in terms of sort of the IR academia, it's the liberal West and it's the liberal Western international order. So obviously, we want the sword to be resilient. We want to maintain it because it benefits us. Sort of implicitly, it's not said like that quite outright, but there is a sense that this is obviously a good thing, and there's no need to discuss it. So I'll leave it at that because of time.
Dankeschön, Lucas. Thank you. My closing comment on that topic, wonderful, a lot of knowledge behind it and well prepared. Military is still for defending. It's the armed participator of the politicians. So yes, and 99% of the military are doing not strategic thinking, but we have to address it right. We have to educate the regular officers, the staff officers, and the senior officers, who are the advisors of the politicians. And of course, it's throughout the world the same, and that's important to maybe differentiate. And strategy is not only military strategy, it's the grand strategy, as the US is saying that, or approaching it. So the politicians are doing the big one, we are doing parts of it. Yes, wonderful, thank you for that. Who's next? Gintautas? Go ahead, you have time now.
I will try to share my screen, and we will see if you are able to see it. It's visible, it's okay?
Yes.
Yes, it is visible, we can hear you and see the slides.
Maybe a little bit I will introduce myself. I am currently officer, commissioned officer, full service. Currently, I am teaching students of tactical management, and what Lucas discussed about concepts and various things I am using in my teaching too. At the same time, I am a PhD student of political science, so I'm combining military knowledge and academic knowledge in one side. And today I am going to present you the strategic design for defense analysis, a structural functionalist interpretation. So today I will share you some insights and findings from the article under preparation. So I hope also not only to share my thoughts, but also to have an opportunity to discuss with you, to get your comments, suggestions, or even critical arguments in order to make this draft of the article even better. So let's begin. For the sake of clarity, the essential task of this presentation is RISE. I intended to familiarize you with the latest insights and findings of the article under preparation. Therefore, unambiguous results will not be presented here. Instead, I will share the path of logic in finding them. To make this process run smoothly, the intent of presentation is as follows. Firstly, I will overview the current alternatives of defense analysis frameworks. Next, I will discuss the key differences between processual thinking and design thinking alternatives. And finally, I will justify a structural functionalist approach as possible alternative to compile strategic design. All these objectives are directed to one purpose: to facilitate efforts in compiling credible strategic design for defense analysis needs. Also, I hope it will have a contribution to my PhD thesis making process. But first of all, I would like to provide a short contextual introduction. It is the second article for my recent efforts in exploring defense phenomena based on the strategic facts agenda. The research agenda of strategic facts was inspired by a recent scholars Breitenbach and Jakobson article entitled Defense Planning, a Strategic Fact Introduction in the Journal of Defense Studies. In my first article, which is currently under review process for publication, I explored the strategic facts from the conceptual side. By exploring primary intellectual sources, Emily Durkheim's writings, especially conception of the social facts, I found the strategic facts as feasible meaning for the future defense studies. The key finding was a conception of three main interconnected spaces of defense reality, which I define as agglomerations of strategic facts. These spaces are the following: defense as politics, defense as strategic management, and defense as war fighting. In this defense as war fighting, Lucas is the concept which I am exploring, the combat power. So the same interpretation is followed in this presentation too. So I must additionally address that this classification is based on Rutledge Handbook of Defense Studies explanations. However, it has differences from the primary sources. Moreover, in the first article, the defense as politics space was explored in more detail, and the results of the study were the justification of the 5 key strategic facts in the defense as politics reality. Today, I'm going to elaborate on my further efforts in exploring defense as strategic management space. Before moving forward, I want to stress one important meaning. That defense as strategic management is a space where political and military elements of national power comes together. In short, it's a space where political ideas must be transformed into meaningful strategic actions. To deal with this complexity, various defense frameworks and for different purposes are used, and so I am going to start with short overview of them. Looking more from the civilian side dimension, we can see various frameworks used in defense matters. Of course, it's not a complete list of possible alternatives. However, a list of frameworks provided allows us to look more in detail at how defense reality is organized and what tools are used to measure this reality. On the left side, we can see the frameworks alternatives used for the specific practical defense needs. On the right side, we can see specific analytical tools used to assess points of defense interests. The same can be said looking more at the military side defense framework list. Various frameworks alternatives provide us with the logic of military logic, how defense realities are organized, and interconnected analytical tools provide us with an understanding of how defense realities are measured to support military users, officers, actually, activities in using specific defense frameworks. When we put defense frameworks into analytical context, we can declare the argument of fragmentation, as we see various frameworks used in defense serve specific needs. While they serve well for a specific defense problem solving, however, they cannot be used in defining and explaining how the defense is organized as a whole. I was unsuccessful in finding one. But to be objective, the Likas concept of strategy can be used for such a need. In fact, Taylor used interpretation of ends, ways, means, conjunction in explaining defense as policy understanding and its connection with a strategy. And I'm going to show you this conception. While Likas concept of strategy is popular around the globe, however, is hardly applicable for practical implementations. It can be said by looking in various political documents and military doctrines. Moreover, recent criticism on the ends, ways, means framework also is additional argument to look for alternative approaches. Because of that, I came to the key conclusion and at the same time the problem. There is a lack of analytical framework that covers and singly explains defense dynamics. In search of an answer, Zybelson article suggests a useful starting insight. The type of thinking plays a key role in compiling and using the specific framework. This argument can be confirmed by looking at other defense frameworks. They can be regarded as processual thinking or design thinking products. Because of that, the natural answer emerged. The need to choose the correct thinking type and at the beginning. It raises the need to discuss in brief the key differences between thinking alternatives. At the comparison result suggests design thinking is a logical choice. It's not so because without paradigm setting, the compilation of framework which covers and singly explains defense is not very likely. In other words, design thinking is a good approach for development of the understanding. However, the already mentioned Breitenbach and Jakobson article and a whole Defense Studies issue number 3 in volume number 18, exclusively dedicated to defense planning, a strategic fact agenda, implies we need to look for other ways of thinking about defense issues. So it's argued that system thinking could be the fruitful alternative for such a need. Moreover, it's argued that a combination of system thinking and design thinking, it could be bring even more meaningful results. The main system thinking contribution is setting understanding about defense system and how those systems interact with each other. The main design thinking contribution is setting understanding about forces, which makes defense system power. Also, design thinking power of visualization is valuable too. So the contribution are strong arguments to use structural functionalist approach in defense studies. Moreover, according to Breitenbach and Jakobson, the return to Emile Durkheim's writings are necessary condition for success. In addition to Breitenbach and Jakobson thesis, it's argued the necessity to bring greater attention to functions of management. In short, the combination of Peter Checkland, Emil Durkheim's, and Henry Fayol's ideas and statements could be fruitful used in compiling reliable strategic design of defense systems in the context of strategic management. Finally, it's argued that the results of such combination can be used for defense analysis purposes. In closing, I would like to highlight the following main contributions of the authors to the following efforts. Checkland could help bring ideas together by using systems thinking. In other words, system of systems. And system thinking, according to him, is consciously organized thinking using system ideas. Durkheim's ideas of social facts could be used in parallel with strategic facts as alternative understanding of natural and artificial systems. And finally, Fayol's interpretations of management functions brings us understanding of cyclic nature of defense and strategic management. So I am on my way to creating a strategic design for defense system that could be used for defense analysis. Of course, once this is done, I hope to publish the results in the article and use it analytical basis for my PhD thesis. So dear participants, thank you for attention. I am ready to answer your questions or to follow the chair instructions. Thank you very much.
Gintautas, thank you, wonderful. Good presentation. I could follow it all through. Nothing really new, but it was a concentrated view on what you were researching on. Now the floor is open for questions of the audience. Are there questions?
I can make a quick comment, if it is allowed. Thank you, Gintautas. It's something I have been dealing with for a while. I have been teaching design thinking at my current university. One of the courses I am teaching is design thinking, and I was wondering if you have checked post-human design principles during your research, because as we know, design thinking is a bit biased towards human centeredness, and this may create some problems in our strategic designs, especially considering the new technological advancements. So it just came to me. Maybe it might be helpful. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, Cagdas, yes, it's okay, pronunciation. Okay, so, yeah, I agree with you that design thinking is actually hardly explained unambiguously. So it's a reason why I am chasing the another approach as systems thinking. And design thinking I am only using for visualization and conceptualization information. Yeah, but systems of systems, how they interact for each other, it's more powerful. And then we're combining some knowledges from different approaches, we can get great results. For example, in my teaching, I am using thinking of terms. It's such a conception. Then you're joining a term with another term and how they are used into one in practice. Actually, in 1 month, or no, 2 weeks actually. In 2 weeks, I published in Lithuanian language the book regarded to this thinking by terms, and it's entitled Reconstruction of Military Terms. So it is used for my students to understand the power of concepts and how they are used in the military reality by understanding them, interpreting them, and using them. These are three pillars on which base the understanding the term's power. So
I have a brief question. Since you said that you're sort of moving away from design thinking and towards systems thinking, I'm just wondering, what, if any, is there any relationship between the systems thinking that you're working with now and the systems analysis, which was popular in the Pentagon during the McNamara era, as well as, say, the sort of methodologies of net assessment, which were popularized by Marshall in his office in the Pentagon. So are there any sort of connections here, or is this a substantially new, unique type thing?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and to answer your question, I want to stress one important thing, what I am writing in my book, that it's not necessary the naming possess the power of this thinking. A lot of Americans' methodologies are processual thinkings, actually, despite of namings, despite of efforts, despite of interest to have it. What I'm interested to make a logical understanding of the gears, how we are using. For example, we all know that there is an order loop. Yeah, it is a great contribution made in military thinking. Observe, oriented, decide, act. Actually, it's have a strong roots to the Fayol's functions of management, and we can connect it in one feasible meaning and to use it in a better way. For example, I have a lot of different methodologies of design thinking from German decision-making process. For example, we have a stronger design thinking how a decision is made. And we can join them together, but making them not like a design or like gear systems, how they are interconnected. And then we can join them together using by design thinking to visualize how it's working, to make it practical understanding. So I don't know if I was fluently in answering your question, but I think in written form it could be more understandable. So.
Thank you. Vicky, any questions?
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting. And I will admit my sort of passion in the academic side is how people actually come to points of decision. Started with master's and carrying on with my own work as a PhD student now. And from what your presentation was showing, it was almost that there's a background of this of, what ways do we have to think before we get to that act of decide? And I'm curious about how you think the systems and design thinking can help people get to that point. And also then as things unfold, do they circle around that you actually question your decision?
Thank you for your questions. And I will try and answer in this way. System thinking, actually, to need to understand the system, as Jacqueline said, it's quite intuitive way. You need to have a great experience to understand what is all about. And to use it in practical side, you need also to have experience in using them. So actually, system thinking, I think, is a great contribution to these efforts. So I don't know if I was able to answer your question.
Dankeschön. May I address you with a question as well? First, okay. Defense, as you use it, and Lucas as well, stands for military activities. Because we as Westerners in post-heroic countries, as it is said in the German literature and theorists, approach always this thinking with defense, but some other cultures don't think so. They do act and use the offense as the best defense, for example. So my question is, do you look in your work, in your research as well, to applicabilities to others? Because it has to be linked to the others. NATO is not fighting against each other. There are different people there. So is there any interaction in your research?
Okay. Thank you for your question. And I do not agree that defense, the concept of defense, is actually only for military activities. As in my PhD thesis, arguing that defense is from one side, if it's a violent competition between militarians, yes, it is defense issue of the military. But competition could be not only violent, yeah. And why it's a Busan conception of political power, economical, and so on, all powers, and those powers can be used for offense without violence, and against some kind of economical power can be used in defense for other economical offense, for example. So in my opinion, I define two concepts in defining defense offense in this side. I am defining the fighting, which is not violent competition, and use it in a broader approach, and war fighting, which is a violent competition used by militarians, especially in this reality, today's reality, not only by militarian, paramilitary, or even the new trend of civil organization which buys and sells violence, private military companies. Yeah. So the main argument is from military side, defining defense as war fighting direction, which opposes war fighting offense direction. There is another two, but stabilization and resistance, and in the center of enabling operations. Actually, it's I got this big picture with presenting to my students. I have this this slide in Lithuanian language. I would show it to you, but you wouldn't understand what is written all about. So I will try maybe to find it.
Thank you for this precise answer. And actually, I was smiling because in Austria, where I'm right now lecturing, they are talking about the umfassende Landesverteidigung. That's a comprehensive approach to defend the nation. And this is not only military, not the hard power stuff. It's as well the economic aspects. It's the society aspect, resilience, and all of that. So Yes, I see your point.
Yeah, if you allow, I found with my found with my presentation slide, and I have also English translations to. I will share with you with my
Yes,
screen.
please.
If you, yeah. So what I said to my students, there is direction. It is reactive war fighting and with proactive war fighting. With regular war fighting and symmetric war fighting, asymmetric war fighting and non-regular fighting. So this logical could be used not only in violent competition, but also in non-violent. So it can be used in much broader way. So maybe this slide could be you bring a better understanding of what I'm meaning about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Now the third speaker, 30 minutes left, or 29. Please, Cagdas, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Yes, we see your slides, and please go ahead.
Thank you again. Good afternoon, everyone. Most of you, I guess, are attending from Europe. I am located in Toronto. Thank you for the great presentations, Lucas and Gintautas. My name is Cagdas. Currently, I am teaching at Yorkville University. I am a political science professor. Before this, I studied and taught in Istanbul, Turkey, mostly on strategy, security topics. I also completed my military service at Turkish National Defense University as a third lieutenant, assistant professor. So my work, I define my work mostly as praxis-oriented, always thinking theory and practice, but also thinking about the limits of the theory to better serve the practice. That's the framework I am trying to find my work. This talk is prepared as a 15-minute talk. Hopefully I will not make it longer. If you have any questions later, I will try to address them because I may not be able to do justice all the components of this topic. The topic, as you saw, is about the idea of posthuman and how it might be integrated with the question of security for sustainable societies. So I will first start with how I understand the posthuman and sustainability, then a short problem definition will come. I will mostly focus on the concept of onto-epistemology. What it means is important in this respect. The aim statement, the purpose statement, and I will focus on the two onto-epistemological terms in social sciences. These are my ongoing research teams, I may say. I believe these two components, these two onto-epistemological terms must be taught together in a research effort. And finally, there is a short thought experiment. We can also improve it together if you want. Okay, what is the posthuman? I use it mostly to define a condition, our current condition, and this condition is the amalgamation of physical, digital, and the biological. So we are now in a condition, we are experiencing a new condition in which these boundaries are blurred. So this is how my research starts. And some people, some scholars also think that we have always been posthuman. So you may also agree with that because we have been transforming our world and also being transformed based on these biological, physical, and digital transformations. Sometimes these are transformations, sometimes disruptions. So I would like to make a distinction between these two situations as well. And in this process, let me say, we mostly show anthropocentric, humanist, and dualist tendencies. Our assumptions care initially, primarily humans, but this care for humans are also limited to some geographies, some gender orientations, or some ethnic religious orientations. So these are, of course, seen as Western conceptualizations and have been criticizing for a while now. So I am following these critics in my research as well. We have always been posthuman, I said, but the current posthuman condition is quite new. In what sense? I primarily pay attention to the fourth, you may say, you may prefer to use fifth, Industrial Revolution, and the sixth mass extinction, and of course, climate change. But these two trends are also not alone in our thinking. They shouldn't be alone in our thinking. We also have the older trends, and they are still persisting. Colonialism, extractivism, which is very much related to the sixth mass extinction as well, and of course neoliberal system. So at that moment, my idea of sustainability is relying on not sustainable development at something focusing on some economies, but I am concerning with the margins. And therefore, I try to integrate justice and inclusion as the other two pillars together with sustainability. These are needed to have a good strategy, a good governance, of course, at governance level first, and also at management level, at analysis level. So this is my desire, and I hope our thinking can arrive at that point. I do not address the questions such as security of whom, how much security, and security through which instruments, because these are the questions of later stages in our thinking. We try to, or we need to focus on the initial motivations in our thinking, and of course, in our lifestyle, in our experience of the world. That's why I am focusing on onto-epistemologies. I am not assuming a linear relationship between onto-epistemologies, research practices, policy decisions, or doctrine development efforts. There is no linear relationship, but these are affecting each other, and mostly we have ontological and epistemological assumptions, and these are, for me at least, are not separated. They are interacting with each other. What we believe to be true about the world, about the relations in this world, are also related to what we believe to be true in terms of knowledge, and we are producing our knowledge accordingly. So these are together. That's why I am using onto epistemologies as a concept. And the purpose here is to integrate the study of ethics and religion as two distinct concepts with the study of security, in order to find a more comprehensive, a more inclusive understanding of strategic thinking, maybe, and hopefully this may create alternative options, alternative onto-epistemological designs for our strategic level analysis. So I will do this from a posthuman viewpoint for sure. And as I mentioned, there are two onto-epistemological terms that we have been witnessing in social sciences for the last few decades, post-secular turn and post-human turn. These two are being studied distinctly in different circles, academic research institutions, but I want to integrate them into a broader and deeper, hopefully, onto epistemological discussion. And we know that multidisciplinarity is a keyword in today's research, academic research in general, and as open science versus research security panel showed us, and the panelists emphasizes it again, it is very important for the study of security as well. But I also want to argue that we also need multiple onto-epistemological interactions. That's why I will focus on onto-epistemologicality as a new concept. First, the post-secular term in security studies. What does it mean and how I understand it? As you know, the term post-secular has been popularized by Jürgen Habermas. He believed that he tried to show us some tendencies in European history and politics that is going beyond the classical traditional distinction between belief and reason. So we do not anymore see secularization trend as a clear linear trend. Maybe it wasn't a linear clear-cut phenomena, never, but after the Cold War period, this became more prominent. But in security studies, there are other scholars who is also dealing with the post-secular term. So this is my main concern here. Luca Maielli is one of these IR scholars, security scholars. He traces the trajectory of the conceptual relationship between security and religion and challenges the widely accepted assumption that the Westphalian nation state, which has built upon a Hobbesian understanding of security, might not be a secular one. So he believes that there was a decline of the Christian worldview at some point, and this was an ontological concern for the people, for the system, just at the end of the medieval period. And contrary to the opinions about the religious wars and the end of religious wars and the outcomes of them, he believes that the secular state or the Westphalian nation state was not the outcome of religious wars. It was the outcome of the same problems, ontological problems that caused religious wars initially. It was the lack of a higher authority in the system, ontologically speaking. And of course, this has epistemological outcomes. So in other words, we can say in the absence of God as a nominalist, ethical, principled God, there was a new version of Leviathan. It was a new version of God, of course, in this sense, and it wasn't secular when we look at the system level situation and how people were connected with that system. And the secular security established by Hobbes rests on the vertical compliance of atomized individuals. That's important, with a Leviathan state, with fear as the motor of obedience. There are three implications for this, but the first two of them are directly related to religion and security conundrum, and I don't want to focus on them now. But the third one, the transformation of the idea of community, is very much related to our study of security, because the new understanding of security necessitated a new understanding of community. And this understanding must be studied more. That's a crucial question for me, at least. But the thing is that Mavelli did not mention posthuman scholars who are interested in the idea of post-secular in today's world, especially in Europe, in the Western context. He didn't mention them, but it might be helpful to look at them in order to understand how the security community today operates in the Western context. So Rose Braidotti is one of these scholars. In their critique, they do not agree with the Habermas version of post-secular, because they believe that we must go beyond the Christian exceptionalism in our thinking and neo-universalist view of ethics that is seen in Habermasian consensus. That is what they call it. And this Habermasian consensus has been also followed or shared by Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, but they see alternatively that Ernest Gellner or Talal Assad have already criticized the political, ideological misconceptions behind it, and also historical flaws of it. At the same time, I want to pay attention to Elaine Graham. She's a theologian, but she's focusing on how our modern / postmodern human experience has been changing because of the technological and scientific advancements. And based on these changes or transformations, she mentions that the post-secular means the boundaries has been blurred between humanity, nature, and technology. This is one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is that the distinctions between sacred or mundane, or believing or not believing, or the meaning of believing, these are changing. And these two perspectives from the posthumous scholars, their views on the post-secular might help us to better understand today's security society. In the Western context, the community is plural and complex in terms of onto-epistemologies. There is no unique, homogenized onto-epistemology among the individuals. We are very diverse, but this is not reflected in the mainstream onto-epistemology of security. So the second turn in security studies, the second onto-epistemological turn, is a post-human turn. For the sake of this research, of course, I am trying to keep it simple, but there are multiple layers of thinking posthuman and posthumanism. There are diverse approaches within it. We can see posthumanism as an umbrella term in this sense. New materialism, object-oriented ontology, actor network theory, these are different philosophical approaches that are defined within the borders, if there's any border, of posthumanism. So how can the idea of post-secular can be integrated with the idea of posthuman in the field of security studies? That's my question here. So mostly the posthuman turn in international relations and in security studies specifically have two purposes. One is to go beyond the distinction of anthropocentrism, ecocentrism, which seems to many of us a little bit oxymoron, because even if we focus on ecocentrism, in practice, it's like anthropocentrism. At the end of the day, we are humans and we have a human-centered position. So we should go beyond this. That's the first concern. The second one, to go beyond techno-fetishism and techno-solutionism. So some teams, of course, are emerging: complexity, agency, relationality, subjectivity, non-human, more than human. These are some new terminologies as well. And two new concepts, for example, complex ecologism, developed by Cagdas and Hobden, to understand today's problems better in terms of global relations, world politics, and international relations and ethics. And also Laura Zanotti developed intra-agental ethos, mostly focusing on agency. There is a basic question whether we share agency with other human and non-human species. What does it mean to think that matter has an agency, direct or indirect? So this is an emerging field that we must pay attention, according to my opinion, in order to understand diverse onto-epistemologies of international relations, and as a subfield or as a separate interconnected field, security studies. So I especially focus on a third group in this emerging scholarship. It's mostly occupied by security scholars, because the initial names I mentioned, Zanotti or Cagdas or Hobden, they are not doing exactly security studies. They are in the field of IR and international ethics, mostly international politics as well. But for example, Audra Mitchell conceptualizes security/ethics as a concept which is different than the ethics of security. So she says she deals with the diverse conceptions, norms, and practices of security that are expressions of ethics. So when we talk about security, when we develop a policy or a doctrine, then we are doing ethics. There is nothing as a separated field or practice called ethics of security. These are always together. So this is interesting for me and helpful.
Cagdas, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Please be aware of the time. If you want to have some questions later on, you have 22 minutes now spoken. Maybe you cut it a bit shorter now, or you come to a conclusive end.
So I have one quick thought experiment. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't want to go in details on these terms: subjectivity, relationality, and agency. If you want later, we can open them a little bit, but they are the concepts, main concepts that we can think about differently. If we have a humanist approach, human-centered, anthropocentered approach, the outcomes in our thinking will be different. If we are taking a posthumanist approach, then the results will be different. So we can talk about it later. But the thing is that these are always have implications for our broader thinking about security and strategy. That's my point here. And the thought experiment I would like to share with you. This is a table including different occupational groups, how they think about climate change, and what their methodologies are. in this respect. So you can see, of course, their methodologies and their positions, their take on climate change are different. And I just thought, what if we add a security analyst to that list, to the table? What would be said about the representative method and possible views? I would say I would place, of course, a security analyst below or above political analyst. They might have similar disciplinary backgrounds, and obviously listening to other disciplines, climatologist, farmer, the Kenyan farmer, political analyst is very much important and appreciated. This is multidisciplinarity, but we must also think about what are the outcomes of experiencing the world in a different way, because there is a direct link between our onto-epistemologies and relations we are developing, decisions we are giving, and actions we are taking. As a conclusion, as you know, Edward Said, a famous critical humanist, once said, peace without justice is not possible. So I want to reformulate it to end my speech. Security without justice, inclusion, and sustainability is not possible. That's why we need a dialogue between different onto-epistemological understandings. Thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, I would be happy to address.
Gintautas, thank you. Well done. I like that one. Open the floor. The floor is open for questions, please. Yes, Lucas.
I can start. This might be a bit of a probably ignorant question, since I know nothing about the things you've been talking about. I just sort of noticed on one of your later slides where you said that the benefits of your approach was the issues of subjectivity, relationality, agential, and so forth. I'm just thinking in terms of what sort of field or body of literature or knowledge is this way of thinking meant to sort of address, improve, sort of replace? So just from my own personal perspective, just on the basis of Clausewitzian strategic theory, to stick with strategy in my case, I'm talking about the strategy as an agential activity. There are strategic agents acting. It's inherently a relational activity because there's relationships among adversaries and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering if you could explain sort of what field or fields is this sort of more opposed to? The thinking that you've been describing.
Thank you, Lucas. Great question. And honestly, I had two questions for you initially during your presentation, and the other was about Clausewitzian strategy. And your question now just make it an interactive talk for me and thinking process. The thing is that, as I mentioned, we have always been posthuman. For example, we can talk about technological devices that are used during a war situation, right? And these, machines, weaponry, anything is also the natural, settings. These all play a role in, if we can say, actants of a strategic thinking, and we must consider them, right? But the thing is that from a humanist approach, if we put ourselves at the center of our thinking, then we may miss some dimensions. And also in today's world, these dimensions have been dramatically increased because of the digitalization, cyber activities, etc. And also in the future, or the future has already arrived, the robotics, etc. So these agental relations should be rethought, and practically this has been done, I guess, but I don't think the philosophical aspects of these changes have been mentioned, discussed enough. So we need a new theory.
Sorry to interrupt. It's the last seconds of the session. It's fantastic to have discussions, you know, but they will kick us out of the session right now. So let me thank you. Wonderful research topics, and the bright fellows you are. Continue that work. And I would love to read more about it in the future, wherever possible, because all aspects are covered so well, but continue on that one. It's worth it. Dankeschön. Regards from Vienna. And now I hand over back to the overall administrator. All the best to you. Dankeschön.
Dankeschön.
Thank you, everyone. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.